All right, so not only did I buy this new mic, but I upgraded this Zencaster account, so I can do these things like I think towards the intro. I don't know if you're hearing the intro,
Yeah,
but
I can hear you. Yeah.
oh yeah, look at us, super professional now.
Do you want me to do audio recording on my side, or it worked well last
Yeah,
time?
let's do the audio recording as well.
Cool.
So I'm gonna open up QuickTime. I just bought a stand for this though, and it hasn't come in yet, so I'm holding this, and it is a hefty mic. It's gonna get heavy. We're gonna have to stop the podcast, not because we get bored, but because my arm strength fails me.
It's cool. Cool seeing the episodes up on Spotify.
Yeah, I put them on YouTube too, so we're making it big time. Yeah, so I didn't use the videos because I wasn't like. So what I did was I uploaded it to Veed, and then Veed allows you to do like a soundbar animation with the
Uh,
thing, and
yeah.
so at least it's like that. But I think I'll start actually putting the videos on. But yeah, I'll share that with you after. Okay, so started the audio recording. So if anything screws up, we got this as well. But I think we're good here. So let me do this intro again. Pro Cycling Bets presents Cycling Explained, episode 4. We're going to be talking about betting in this episode. Nick is here again. Thank you very much for spending time with us. And feel free to just kick it off. I mean, I think betting is intrinsically interesting. You've mentioned that before with respect to cycling. So, do you have any questions to get us going?
Yeah, we talked about betting a bit in a previous episode together. I guess we could probably start from the top again. I guess in different sports, I know you can make bets on different like events happening or scenarios happening. So what would you say are kind of like the top bets that people would make in pro cycling?
Yeah, for sure. So there's two main types of bets that people make in terms of cycling. It's who is going to win the race or the stage. So you there's a little nuance to that which I'll dig into, but there's also head-to-head bets. So it's facing off two competitors against one another. And when you're betting on it's similar to horse racing where when you're betting on who is going to win the race, because there's so many options to who is going to win the race, they also let you bet on the top 3. So they'll give you some money if your rider places second or third as well. But they only allow you to do that by they force you into making 2 bets, which is called an each way bet. It's a bad name. I don't know why they call it the each way bet. There's a lot of things in betting that are way too complicated. I think they'd get a lot more people betting if it wasn't as complicated. Like some of these odds just don't make sense to me at all. But the each way bet is done so you're placing one bet for your rider to win, and then you're placing another bet on your rider to get top 3 slots. But you can't do a top 3 slot bet without placing the bet for your rider to also win. So there's 2 distinct bets going down. So let's take an example. Let's say your rider wins the stage. You will get both those bets will win. You'll make back your money for your rider winning the race. You'll get the odds for that. You'll also win the bet for your rider placing the top second or third slot. Let's say your rider comes second. You will lose the bet for the rider placing first, but you will win the bet for the rider placing second or third. Does it matter if your rider comes second versus third? Like, will you make more money if your rider comes second, right, or compared to third? No, doesn't matter. So if your rider comes third, it's all good. There is a drop off though in terms of odds. So for example, let's say your rider is 16-1, which is a usual bet odds, and we'll get into why it's so high compared to other sports. But let's say your rider is 16-1 and they come second. When you are placing the bet, the UI will display the drop off in odds. And they don't do this in a good way. Again, it's very unintuitive. They'll show you 1/4 generally or 1/5. So that means the odds will either be dropped off by 1/4 or 1/5. I can do math on 16 to 1 odds. That's 4. So it's divided by 4 for the 1/4.
I see.
But recently, some of the betting markets have been doing 1/5, and we can dig into why they're doing 1/5 versus 1/4. It's usually because they just have less knowledge or there's more competition, but essentially they want to take less risk, so they'll do a heavier drop off for second and third.
I see.
But what that means is you will only make back 4 times your bet on the each way. So it drastically reduces the amount of money you're making in terms of an each way bet when your rider comes second or third. So if your rider comes first, it's a huge win for you because you win both those bets and you have better odds on that initial bet compared to if you win second or third, because you don't win your initial bet and your other bet is reduced in its value by that drop off, which is either 1/4 or 1/5. Does that make sense?
I think so. Maybe we could use some real numbers. Let's say I'm placing like a $10 bet on an each way bet on a rider. Like, how much would I get back if they come first, and how much would I get back if they came second?
Yeah. So I usually start with when I explain this to people, I usually start with dollar numbers that are super, super simple. So let's say you place a $1 bet. $1 is a good way to start. And give me an odds that is divisible by 4 and 5. Or maybe
So
just 4. Let's say 4. Divisible by
okay,
4.
so
What
yeah,
do you
let's
want?
say like 1 to 16.
Sure. 16. Sounds good. So let's say you have a great day. You pick the right rider. You're very smart. So I'm sure you would have picked the right rider. They come first. You win both those bets. So the money you put down was $2 because you were forced into making 2 bets at $1. And so you win your first bet and you always win your money back. So you always win your bet back. So you won $16 plus $1 on that first bet. You won $17 on that first bet. You also won your second bet, but your second bet was reduced in odds by 4. So you won your $1 back times, and you also won $4 with that bet. So you won $5 on that bet. So in total, your new bank balance is 22 for your $2 bet because you won 16 plus 1 and 4 plus 1, which is 22. There you go.
And that $4 is because 4 is 1/4 of 16.
Correct. And I assumed a 1/4 drop off because that's usually what the drop off is. Recently, it's been 1/5, which has been depressing to say the least. It's not very much fun. And it goes, when you make an each way bet, what I also recommend is you think about the total payoff. So you are essentially guaranteed to make your money back if your rider, like, I like doing safe bets, and we'll kind of get into that. But what I think about is, will you make your total money bet that you're forced to put down depending on the odds? And that is only the case is if let's say your rider only comes second or third, which is much more likely than your rider placing first. So I prefer to do that especially where the top slot is usually taken up by one of the big 6 riders who have very short odds. So the big 6 riders will almost always win the race. And they'll get odds of like 1.25 or 1.8, normal odds that you'd see in other sports like the NFL or the NHL. And so what you're really looking for is who's going to take second or third. And because that's where I look for value to find these riders who are, super long odds. But even when the drop off comes into play, will I make my money back? And the only way you'll make your money back is if the odds are higher than the drop off. So they have to be higher than 4.0 or 5.0, depending on if the drop off is 1/4 or 1/5. Because if you think about it, let's take your $1 bet again. You're forced to place $2. You lose the first bet, so you've lost $1. And then the amount you win back, let's say you have 1/4 drop off odds, you'll win back $1 on your next bet, which is $2, which is the amount you put down. So you've neutralized your bet for the day.
Gotcha.
But let's say the odds on the rider was 3.25 or 2.75 or what have you, you will only get back like 70 cents on that dollar. And then for the day, you're down 30 cents. Because let's say, you put down $2 and you got back on your each way bet. On your second bet, you made 70 cents, which is still 30, if you do the math,
Yeah.
$2 minus $1.70 is 30 cents you've lost. So that's not great. So because you're forced into making that second bet, sometimes you do lose money depending on the odds. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're making those bets.
Yeah. So is that kind of how you see it? If it's like odds that are whatever better payoff than 4-1, then it's like, okay, I'm like gonna make my money back as long as they're top three. And if they're first, then it's like big payoff. Is that kind of see like you have a potential big win and then a safer like make your money back?
Yes. So there's a lot of ways to structure bets, and I'm happy to discuss them all. I don't think we'll have time to discuss them all in this one episode, so we'll probably have to do more. But what I deem value is between 12 and 15. So if the odds are between 12 and 15, your rider still has probably a good chance of making the win or getting the win, but it still has enough payout to make it worthwhile. Personally, again, this depends on the individual. If you love betting, maybe shorter odds is fine. But for me to spend the time to do the research, etc., 12 to 15 is a payoff that I deem respectable. Again, a lot of my bets are much, much higher. So like 101 or 201
Oh wow,
or
yeah.
even like 751 to 1 was one I put down today. I didn't win it, but the rider came top 10, and that for me is respectable. It means that like compared, what I look for is essentially misplaced odds, is what I'm going for. So 750 to 1 was extremely misplaced. Or 400, there was another rider who was 401 to 1, and both of them came top 10 out of 180 riders. And you're like, this doesn't, even though I lost them, something was wrong with their odds calculation. Uh, if you just do some math on the based on the number of riders and how likely they are to win, no one should be 751. Like out of, I shouldn't win $751 if I place a dollar bet, and that rider comes into the top 10. So, and this happens a lot in cycling. There's just so many variables in play, and the ingestion mechanism and the calculation, like they run models on these things to produce these
Oh wow.
results. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, I talk to people in the industry, and they do have these calculations that do these odds generation, but they just, I mean, we can talk about cycling for days because there's so many nuances, there's so many layers to the onion, and that's what makes it beautiful. But it's also really hard to produce good odds sometimes, just for all the riders. For 180 riders, you have to produce odds. You're going to screw up. Like it is a very difficult problem. And thankfully, though, they are kind of blessed in the fact that it is also very hard for your rider, despite how misplaced the odds are, to come in the top three,
Regardless of yeah.
right? Regardless. So you may find these misplaced odds, and your rider, given the odds, it might make sense for them to be placed 50th in the race, but they may actually come seventh because it was just wrong. But seventh isn't good for you as a bettor. Like
Yeah.
your rider has to come top three, and the betting house doesn't really lose out either because they were like, oh, you know. But it's just so hard to come top three that even though the odds are often skewed, they don't actually face the music per
Yeah.
se,
Yeah, no, I get
just
that.
because of how the betting market works.
Cool. I
And
want to go. I want to go more into strategy, but I want to ask another kind of high level question. For each way, typically, is an each way bet available for every single rider, or only some of the riders?
generally, it depends on the race. and also the caliber of the rider. So, whew, for smaller races, they won't offer as many odds for the riders just because it's difficult to produce the odds, or they may not have enough data given the lower level caliber of riders who are racing. There's just not enough data for them to produce odds. You can request odds on riders. It says like click here to request more, which will then you can open an email to send to them. It's recommended not to do that too often because your account will get marked and flagged, and you'll be limited on the amount you can bet. It's quite common for people to get limited on the amount you can bet. What our friends in the industry tell us, though, is to send that email, which the link opens up into from a different email than your account is from, so that you will never really get marked. So if you really do think a rider should have odds, or you really want to place it on that rider because you think they're going to win, send that email, but just send it from a different account than the one that your account is sending from. It's a helpful tip there.
And typically, when requesting odds, they're like somewhat likely that they'll get back to you and actually make that a bet you can place.
Yeah, they're pretty quick on it. So it depends on obviously the betting site that you're using, if they're more focused on cycling than not, or if they have good customer service. But one such as Bet365, for example, will get back to you within a reasonable amount of time. And then I did want to circle back on your question regarding so for larger races, though, every rider will generally have odds. And the longest odds you'll typically see are still insane, but I think they max out at 1,001. You'll never typically have a rider actually. Sometimes. Again, our biggest win was 601 to 1, and that rider came second. So, you can still win these really long odds, that and that's what makes it exciting, right? Because if you can find those values, it's not it's kind of like searching for gold to some degree, but it's not. It's possible. It depends on the day, it depends on the type of race, and sometimes you're more likely to find value than other times. So it just depends. What's interesting though is the odds. This is slightly tangential, but the odds calculations don't reflect the current status of the rider and the effects of the races very well, very quickly, because
Okay.
it seems to rely too heavily on past data. So let's take, for example, Derek G, who was racing quite well at the Giro and clearly given free rein after he started winning. His odds were still extremely long for most of the other stages, even though he was in the breakaway, which is, the small group that forms that potentially can win the race almost every other day. But he still had odds at around 151 to 1 or 125 to 1 compared to his initial 601 to 1, which was intriguing because it was very obvious to most viewers that he was going to be allowed in the break and that he was almost always coming top 4. So it was almost always free money, but the models hadn't adjusted to recognize that information, and because it relies on past race data. And so there's some things that I do want to call out that are important for bettors to take into account, which is knowledge that the betting markets won't generally take into account. So this includes chatter in the media. This includes interviews. Interviews is a huge one. It's well worth a bettor's time to pay attention to those post-race interviews and those pre-race interviews, especially. I'm not up early enough to be listening to the pre-race interviews enough, but I have found at times when I do get up at 3 a.m. or what have you and listen to those pre-race interviews, it tells you things that are like, sometimes riders will explicitly state they're becoming more and more candid, especially the younger riders these days. And they'll just say, "Yeah, I'm going to go for the stage. I'm going to try, and I'm going to ride." And the betting markets don't take this into account. They can't. Like, there's only so many people working at these betting houses, and they're not ingesting information from live TV streams. So some of your best bets are done just by having this information about the riders that you can glean publicly, and it is no, you just be being someone who's super invested in cycling and watching it and loving it can pay off, which is quite fun. And yeah, so there's also other variables that the betting doesn't take into account, but it's just something I did want to call out.
That's cool. And if I'm understanding correctly, it sounds like cycling is super sophisticated. There's lots of different factors that play into performance, and it's kind of like too sophisticated for these betting houses to stay like super on the ball. There's a lot of riders. There's like a lot of variables and a lot going on. So if you're a really savvy or even like a somewhat savvy like fan and like what you're following and you know what's going on, you would kind of constantly have that edge because like that live data isn't getting factored into the models quick enough,
Yeah,
basically.
100%. And it's really exciting, to be honest, when you have, because you start to build the knowledge. And what I recommend to those just getting into betting on cycling is, it may seem daunting at first, but just like anything else in life, once you start building this knowledge on these riders and everything else, your betting tends to improve and get better and better. There is, I'm finding at this point in time where I'm getting to like a very high level of knowledge on most of the riders, it becomes a little bit trickier to filter out the noise, just because you now have information on so many riders and you know them, they're all sort of good. And so you kind of have to start building I'd recommend maybe a spreadsheet of who's good at what. Specific riders are good at specific stages. They suited to different type, for example, Ben Healy, he's an Irish rider. He's very good at rouleur based stages, but the betting market do know that as well. So
Gotcha.
they do a good job at matching the rider to the stage. But another helpful hint for people getting the betting is podcasts are your friends. So there's a number of riders who have their own podcasts. There's a number of podcasts that talk about riders and the performance and all that jazz. And again, getting information from all these sources is healthy, because you don't want to listen to just one source. You want to have a bunch of different sources so as not to be biased. It's the same as in news media. And when, again, these betting markets don't take into account, this random rider's podcast or this random rider's YouTube video, because one of the most difficult things in betting for cycling, and I'm going to promote the book that's going to come out, in a couple months, but is betting is knowing who is riding for the team, right? So you have 8 riders, and determining who the leader is for that day is exceedingly hard to figure out.
Interesting.
And it's probably the downfall of a lot of people when they're bet on cycling, just because you could put money on a rider who you think is good, but if the team hasn't deemed them as the leader for the day, well, I have to say, I was going to say, you're beep out of luck. Let's try and keep this a clean podcast. But essentially, determining leadership, determining who has freedom, is your first course of action when placing a bet on cycling. Because if you don't get that right, then you may as well throw away that money. And then the next thing is, you got to determine, is a break going to be possible? A break from the peloton, are they going to let that break go? And then, or is it going to be a GC action day or a sprint day, right? So you got to think about all those things. Those are the basics, right? Because if you don't get who is riding, then again, you throw that money away. If you put your money on a breakaway rider and the break doesn't form, throw that money away. And then finally, is it a GC day or a sprint day, depending on if a break isn't allowed to go. And those are I would say, if you're going to place a bet, do those first before placing a bet on a rider, because if you can't guarantee those, then again, you're kind of throwing the money away. And to be fair, we don't always know if the leader is going to be who the leader is going to be, and that's why sometimes it makes sense to place bets after the first stage of a multi-day stage race, but oftentimes the betting markets won't let you place an each way bet on the overall winner after the race kicks off.
Gotcha.
So sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's kind of, again, they have all the power. So, you'll have much more information once the first stage kicks off, because you'll probably start to figure out which horse the team is going to put their money behind. And in horse, we're talking about riders here, but sometimes it's not always clear still after stage one, because usually teams run with a multi-horse strategy. They'll have 2 riders who they're out of their 8 who they're
Gotcha.
potentially going to let win. But again, you usually have more information than you prior did. That being said, pay attention to team social medias, pay attention to the posters they put out. It'll be kind of, even the posters, even the images they put out on Instagram or
Oh,
Twitter,
wow.
usually have the two front runners situated first, big in front, and then they'll have like riders back, and you'll kind of be able to figure out, again, it's nuanced and it's not always sure. Like some people have, like some pundits are like, teams should explicitly state who they're riding for. Like it would make everyone's lives a lot easier, but that's just how it goes. You don't know, and teams don't want to tell other teams, because from a tactics perspective, it's super beneficial to not know, for other teams to not know who's riding, because then they have to mark during the race. When I say mark, they just have to, if a rider attacks, then they have to mark that rider, because they don't know if that's the lead rider, or they don't know if they're, the team's behind them. And so they have to spend extra energy on marking these attacks and following these riders, because who knows? Maybe they could be the leader.
I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that was like a closely kept secret, but I see how that would be advantageous for the teams to keep a secret. And I see how that's like makes it trickier for bettors, because they're also trying to figure that out.
Yeah, it's tricky for everyone involved. So, pros and cons there.
Well, I want to. You mentioned you're not able to place bets on the entire tour once the first stages happen. For other type of bets, like an each way bet, when's like the latest I could place it? Like right before the stage starts, or what's the timing typically?
Yeah, so the timing is usually depending on the caliber of the race. The bets will come out earlier. So, you'll have Tour de France betting odds and Giro betting odds in January, when the races kick off in May and July, respectively. We don't recommend locking your money up that early unless there's like an exceedingly good deal. For example, like you think someone's going to win, the odds are super long, and as a rider starts to perform throughout the season, they'll get shorter and shorter odds, because it will factor that in and say, hey, this rider's performing well, we're going to give them shorter odds. But then for most stage races, let's say a high caliber stage race, you'll probably get, let's take the Tour de Suisse, which is just about to go on today. It just started. The odds came out on Friday midday. So almost always the odds will come out at 5 p.m. UTC time. So I think you're in UTC time now in England. And it will come out for the following day's stage, and you can start betting up until the race starts. And then when the race starts, you still place we place some live in play bets today on a stage. So they still offer live odds as well, which can sometimes be good deals, because you have a lot more information once the race is ongoing, especially prior to the final. But yeah, usually they come out about 12 hours prior to the start of the race, maybe a bit longer, 16 hours, doing some math there, and you'll be able to place down bets. And then for the really, really small races, it'll come out like, sometimes they're super slow, and they'll come out like a few hours before.
Oh,
just
wow.
because they only have so many resources, right? They're trying to create liquidity in the market, and so if they think there's going to be enough people betting on it, they'll spend some resources on it, which means like man hours, people generating these and honing them, and sometimes. But again, the betting markets for cycling is still very niche. We have one friend in the industry who has on a day, you know, it's not one of the big betting houses, but he has about maybe people like 16 to 20 people placing bets, right? So again, this is, I'm sure Bet365 has thousands of people, but it's still relatively small compared to most of the other major sports because you only have so many people placing the bets. And if you're not in the major markets, so again, Belgium will have much more people placing bets, but they all use different apps. There's a myriad of apps out there. So it just becomes a matter of liquidity at that point.
Super cool. I want to follow up on one other thing we talked about really early on the episode. You mentioned head-to-head bets. What's a head-to-head bet, and how's it different in each way?
Yeah, head to heads are super fun because some days they don't let you parlay them, but sometimes they do. Parlaying is also, I believe, called doubling in your part of the world, in Europe. Essentially, a head to head bet pits two riders against one another, and you get to pick which rider will win. And so it's quite, you'll get odds that are similar to NHL or NBA or any of the major sport leagues odds, and they'll generally be around 2.0 odds. And so you'll have two odds. One will be favoring one rider to place higher than the other rider. And while we personally still trying to find value by doing a bit of research and then parlaying a few of these bets together. So what that means is you only make the money if you're all the bets that you place together win. So let's say we have rider A against rider B, rider C against rider D, and rider E against rider F. We probably skipped a letter in there, but bear with us. We place bets on rider A winning, rider C winning, and rider E winning. We will only make the money if all three of those win. Even if riders A and C win, we will lose the money if rider E doesn't win as well. So we have to have a consecutive chain of riders winning. But what happens, why we like it, is it multiplies the total bet. So if you have 2 odds on each of those winning, you'll have a maths, an 8 overall, an 8 average, like 1 to 8 average odds. So if you bet $1, you'll win $8 back. Compared to if you did each of those bets separately, you'd win $2, like $6 kind of thing net. Not net. So overall, you get a higher. Oh wait, we did maths bad there, did we? No, two.
No, I think
Yeah,
that was
no,
right.
that makes sense. Yeah, and what we find is that you can generally find they won't offer. They'll probably, depending on the race, they offer a lot. Like again, the high caliber races, you'll get like some of the monuments, which are these like 1 day mega extravaganzas that people really care about. You'll get probably 30 matchups of 30 riders compared to smaller races where you'll generally see around 10 matchups of the main GC general classification contenders who are in the race.
Yeah.
Out of that, and so they'll generally pick two riders who are close to one another in the standings and then like pit them against one another. There's sometimes they pick really random ones like 33rd versus 35th place. And for that, we never really bet because there's no, it's such a mental game cycling at the end of the day. A lot of endurance sports are mental games. And, we can talk for hours about all the mental aspects, about what factors in. But what we try and do is pick those riders who have a reason to perform better than that competitor. The 35th rider doesn't really have a reason to place better than the 33rd rider, right? There's certain prestige to placing top 10. This is a big one. So we'll almost always pick riders who, a rider will want to maintain their general classification standing if they're in the top 10. Like if you're 7th, you want to maintain 7th or get better. Like you really do. And if you're 12th, you really want to reach the 10th spot. And so the problem is they'll often pit like 10th against 12th, and then you kind of like have to factor in, which rider is going to be better on that stage. And you can do that though. Like with enough research, you can usually factor in. Like recently we struck out, but we've hit 3 out of 4. Right, like when our parlays, we've hit 3 out of 4 both times pretty easily. Like it took us 10 minutes, but I'm just giving you an example. The past 2 days, and we deem that good because our bets was good enough to get 3 out of 4. That's pretty good for 5 minutes of work.
Yeah.
But a rider in 33rd and 35th, you're just throwing your money away there because in our opinion, because those riders generally don't have any reason to perform better than one another. They're not going to try.
Yeah,
Like
I see.
they don't know that you're betting on them. So why are they going to at the end of the stage race, like if they're not going to win, or they're just going to sit up, as they say, and just like whatever, I'm just going to pedal it in. But the thing with the top 10 riders and the riders close in GC standing, they'll always try. And that's what matters, because a lot of times in cycling, riders, there's this thing called work, where either a team is working on the front of the peloton or a rider is working. And the most important thing is, well, sorry, not the most important thing. That was the wrong prelude to this. But what riders will always try to avoid work. Teams will always try to avoid work if they don't have to do work. And so if there's really no reason for the 33rd or the 35th rider to work. And it's
Yeah, I see.
also, things to stay away from in head-to-head bets are domestiques. So domestiques are riders who support the leaders for the team. They're going to do their duty. They're going to do their work, get the rider into the position that they want to get into, and then they're just going to sit up. They're going to take their foot off the gas, and they're going to, start eating protein, prior to the end of the stage race. And they're just going to chill out. They're going to get ready for the next day to do their work. They're not going to care about beating competitor X who they're pitted against in the head-to-heads. And then you also have, so we don't put money on those domestiques if they're a domestique rider. We really only put money on those GC contenders, because the GC contenders are going to have a reason to always fight to the end and always try and beat that other competitor at the end of the day. So it just it kind of broaches the head-to-head betting picture and kind of stuff to start thinking about when you're placing these bets. Like, anyway.
Nice. No, it makes a lot of sense. You mentioned parlaying head-to-head bets. Would you say there's something like unique about like pro cycling betting that makes parlaying a better option, or kind of like more likely to be successful than other sports? Or would you say it's like generally a good strategy?
I think you can rack up because of let's take MLB, for example. So Major League Baseball, we have one friend who's really into baseball, really loves their baseball, and even they tell us that at the end of the day, each game is kind of a toss-up, right? So you'll get the same odds as what you get in these cycling head-to-head bets, but the 2.12s and the 1.7s, like over the long run, it's going to make sense and it's going to work out, but you really don't know who's going to win the game. And so what we've realized in cycling is like you really do know who's going to win this matchup. Like if you do spend this time, uh, the head-to-heads is interesting in the fact that it's not like a team against a team. Like there's actually a lot less variables in play than generally betting on the overall of who's going to win a cycling race or who's going to win an MLB game. There's just two riders who want to win the race, and then you just have to really compare what the rider is good at doing to the stage. And once you do that a few times, you begin to gain a base level of knowledge of these riders, and it becomes pretty explicitly obvious who is going to win, in our opinion. Again, maybe we're just degenerate and spend way too much like time looking at these cyclists, but it's much more obvious to us. And so by parlaying, we can generally get an odds of around 18 rather easily by around, usually we do around 4 riders in a parlay, and you can rack up an odds of about 18, and you can make this money back pretty well, right? Like, we're not going to say we're going to win every time, but generally we're hitting 3 out of 4 most of the times, and we're spending $1. And if you're winning $18, maybe say every fourth time, still pretty good, right? So you can't do this every day though. Some days doesn't make sense, right? Like if it's a sprint stage, again, we don't bet on sprint stages on head-to-heads because it's a toss-up. You're flipping a coin most of the time. To be fair, no, there's better sprinters than other sprinters, but there's just too many variables at the end of the day for sprint. So we really only do head-to-head bets for GC contenders on hilly stages, because otherwise, again, you're throwing your money away. Because if a break's going to win the stage, then the GC contenders don't really care. They're all going to finish together. So you got to be really careful about throwing your money away. Like, avoid. We should probably just write an article on don't throw your money away on these things, on these facets, on these races, because there's a lot of things to stay away from. Actually, we're going to write that down because that's a great thing to stay away from. Some very, very obvious traps to avoid. So we'll make a note of that. We'll post it to the channel. We'll post it, links down below. But yeah, again, avoid throwing your money away. Sometimes not placing a bet is better than placing a bet. We fall into this trap. We're human. We like placing bets because it's fun to us. But if you want to be a really professional bettor and you really want to be, strict, some days there's just not value in those picks, and some days the stage isn't right. Some days the right move is to not place a bet. I do want to call that out.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense. So just want to check, are there other types of bets? We talked about like each ways for a stage. We've talked about head-to-heads. Does that kind of cover it?
Yeah, so those are the two main bets, and then again you have the live in-play bets, which offer action on who is going to win the stage, for that, which is also sometimes a good option. Sometimes there's good value there, and if you're watching the stage, like, we do recommend it sometimes just to check out the odds. And hey, it makes it a lot more fun. Sometimes you're like, oh, this guy's going to win, because again, that's what we want to promote too. Like, some of the reason why we love cycling is because betting on cycling in a healthy manner is fun. And if any of your kids are watching this, just, again, we don't know how you sign up to the betting apps, but we do find it enjoyable aspect, as long as you stay within a reasonable. You have rules you set up for yourself, and you set those up. Those are important. Finally, though, we do you mentioned bets, and so for the big races, they do offer more options, which are a lot of fun. So for the major Grand Tours, they'll offer way more options, like maybe 10 options. So some of these are: who's going to win the King of the Mountains jersey? Who's going to win the points jersey? How many riders will win 2 or more stages? Like, will this rider win 2 or more stages? And they'll list a bunch of riders and give the odds. Will this rider win at least one stage? And they'll give a bunch of odds. Who is the team who's going to win the overall Giro? They have a teams classification. They offer a bunch more fun kind of odds, just because there's so much more liquidity in the market. Like, people come out of the woodwork to actually, non-degenerates come out of the woodwork to watch Giros. They watch the Tour, they watch the Vuelta, so you'll get all these different odds. And it's kind of fun just to explore some of these odds that these betting markets are offering. One of the funny ones we saw was, there's a rider who, British people really care about, is I'm forgetting his name. This is horrible, but he's a sprinter, and they're like, how many stages will he win? And I was like, it was just like, it specifically called him out, which I found quite funny, because they almost never just like, how many stages will rider X win? Like, that's just not a thing. But just because he's super popular in Britain, then they offered that as an option.
Interesting. And for what's your take on these kind of more niche types of bet? Like, generally stay away from them, or like worth looking into because could have a good return?
Yeah, the returns are always not super value, so for riders winning a stage or whatnot. Where we did have success and we do potentially recommend it is with the King of the Mountains or the points classification. We think those should be offered for more races, to be honest, because, well, first, I think it's just a fun aspect of the race that people aren't thinking about as much, and it gets people thinking about it and increases enjoyment for the audience. But we also think it's you can find good value. The odds are long enough where they'll have like 30 to 1 odds on riders, and you can do the research and figure that out. For that case, though, that's really hard, though. And we don't really recommend doing it prior to the race kicking off. You'll lose the option of, doing that 1, 2, 3 for the King of the Mountains classification or the points classification. But figuring out like whether the rider is riding for the points jersey is or the King of the Mountains jersey is pretty tricky. Like it's already tricky to figure out if a rider is riding as a leader for the team, but then to figure out prior to the race actually kicking off if they're gonna ride for the points classification at King of the Mountain is pretty much throwing your money away. Like it's hard to do unless they explicitly state it, and they might explicitly state it. Sometimes they do. Like prior to the Giro, there was a rider who explicitly stated his intention to go for it. He didn't win it, but riders will explicitly state that. It's still something to keep in mind, though, that it's hard and it's risky. So we might recommend holding off until the race actually starts before placing those bets.
Cool. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that was a great coverage of all the different kind of at least service level dynamics. I'm sure we'll dive in deeper later, but
Yeah,
yeah,
there's definitely stuff I'm happy to dig in deep on, and we can get a little nerdy around how you should structure your bets, or you know what whether the bet on sure thing, like how much to bet is another good one, and how to break into betting. How much, if you're new to betting, how much should I be placing down money wise? And also, we've created this concept of stacking and head to head bets, and isolating in head to head bets, and those are fun topics to discuss. If people are interested, we will link those in the podcast description on the blog articles about those. But I'm sure Nick will maybe be gracious enough to jump on again next week or the following week, and we can dig into those a little bit as well. So, but we appreciate Nick's time. We appreciate everyone listening. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe on YouTube. Comments are always good. Liking is always good. Anything like that. Overall, though, we hope you be smart with your money, but have fun, play some bets, and thanks, Nick, for his time. This has been Pro Cycling Bets with Brent and Nick. Here's the outro. All right. Ciao, folks.